Mimi Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi naapa kwamba nitakuwa mwaminifu kwa Jamhuri ya Kenya na kuitumikia kwa moyo wangu wote, na kwamba nitaihifadhi.
Power can do all sorts of things. When you've got it, then you behave differently from how you are behaving when you're sitting innocently like that, and you won't think you'll hurt a fly. Get the power, and then you'll be a different terror. Somebody who's using all the sinews in your body to crush others who might be aspiring to occupy the seat you're occupying.
His journey to the top could well be described as one of the most unlikely. In the pre-independence leadership circles, he was just a little more than a mere background feature in a scene dominated by far more superior political operatives.
I must admit, I didn't want Moi at all to succeed Kenyatta, because I've known Moi. He was a member of Rift Valley Legislative Council, so I knew him as a soft-spoken person. He was not aggressive, and naturally, by nature, I want somebody aggressive. I wanted to see aggressiveness, which I didn't see in Moi.
Like many others, veteran politician John Keane had underestimated Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi. Legend had it that a Kenyatta administration provincial commissioner had taken the belittling a step higher, landing a slap on the cheek of the then soft-spoken Vice President of the Republic. But out of being underestimated, Daniel Arap Moi cunningly constructed a platform upon which he rested a rock-solid political career that included an unparalleled 24 years at the helm as President of the Republic.
Poor fellow, he was very innocent. He thought he was Vice President and very, very safe. And just like today, I mean, there are quite a number of people who are unaware of what is going behind the scene.
Daniel Arap Moi's presidency began in 1978 on a seemingly innocent, even feeble note. The most harmless man in Kenyatta's ego-dominated cabinet stepped onto the shoes of a titan and a volcanic landscape that included underhand political games that had viciously been at play with the aging of Kenyatta. And apparently conscious not to ruffle feathers so early in the day, Moi played it safe, declaring that his presidency will only follow Nyayo, Swahili for footsteps, of his predecessor, Jomo Kenyatta.
Moi, in the beginning, was a very down-to-earth man as a person. Visit him, you'll see. He's down to earth. He would even get a seat for you to sit and even bring you water.
The first statement that Moi gave was, nitafuata nyayo zake. That is, I'm not changing from what Kenyatta was.
It started off very, very well, but then I think he felt insecure. He felt that perhaps all these people, I mean, we all followed Nyayo, and the Nyayo that we thought we were following was Kenyatta Nyayo. But then he changed, and we were following his Nyayo.
Yet Charles Njonjo, presumed a one-time close confidant, is listed among names and events behind the subsequent transformation of Daniel Arap Moi. Did he plot against Moi? Did he, Charles Njonjo, want to be president?
Never, and if I did, my friend, I would have been, because when Mr. Murumbi resigned from being the vice president, we were without a vice president for some while, and Kenyatta was agonizing as to who we should appoint. And then one day we were just talking, and I told him, why don't you appoint Moi? You know, that was as if I had said something wonderful, something that, you know, inspired from above. And the following morning, he appointed Moi as his vice president.
I think Georgia was ambitious. He saw himself possibly later on as a possible president.
An attempted military coup on the 1st of August 1982 worsened Moi's already insecure status, and from then on, the man was never the same again.
We had reached a stage where you looked over your shoulders every time. You were suspicious. You didn't trust even your wife sometimes.
He changed immediately. Attempted coup came around. That's what changed Moi to be what we all now know he was.
I think that is the first time that Moi's government was threatened, and he definitely woke up to the possibility that that his government could be changed. And I think that is when Moi went out of his way to do everything possible to reconsolidate his government and his rule, using every means possible, including constitutional amendments.
The man turned out to be very fastidious, extremely fastidious, that then he started arresting people. Remember, in 1992, he arrested more than 4,000 characters, you know. Those 4,000, majority of them belonged to the armed forces, that is the Kenya Air Force, and a few from the streets of Nairobi, those that appeared to support, and at the same time he dismissed from his cabinet many people that appeared to have supported, you know, the attempted coup.
With ruthless resolve, Moi swiftly moved to consolidate his power by dismantling all other perceived centers of power, such as Charles Njonjo, and to choke all other supposed avenues to power, such as political parties.
So in 1982, we decided that we wanted to form a political party. And so we sat down, we prepared the manifesto, prepared the constitution. And when they heard that we were about to apply for registration, then they rushed the constitutional amendment to introduce Section 2A, which now made the country a de jure single-party dictatorship. That was done within one day, as you know.
To contain the political opposition, the Moi administration moved to insert into the constitution what was to become the contentious Section 2A, formally making Kenya a single-party state in 1982.
I think the system has been cheated. That if we don't amend that section, Odinga was going to take the matter to court, and that will not, the amendment will not be allowed. So there was a very big rush to amend that particular point. It was moved by Njonjo and seconded by Kibaki.
KANU was a yes party. Anything that Moi says or Kenyatta said, it was accepted. It was a yes party. Who could have opposed Kenyatta? Who could have opposed Moi? You risk going to detention because we had detention laws.
With the political space shrinking under the post-coup attempt climate, criticism of the Moi regime came from the quarters he least expected. A vibrant atmosphere at the higher institutions of learning, particularly the University of Nairobi, was at its peak, and both lecturers and student leaders were blunt in expressing political opinion.
I remember the 1980s because that is when I was at the university early in the 80s, and I recall in 1982, just before the coup attempt, university lecturers, some of whom were my own teachers, were detained under the Preservation of Public Security Act. So I recall that period as being very, very repressive.
They immediately arrested one of us, George Anyona, just before we presented the papers. But we remember that this was also preceded by the arrests of several other intellectuals, academia from the university, people like Edward Oyugi, people like Moji Wachira, people like Mukaru Nganga, people like Willy Mutunga, people like Katama Mukangi, Professor Alamin Mazrui. All these were arrested and detained without trial, and just following the introduction of Section 2A.
The students in the 80s, in the early 80s, were building on a tradition that existed at the university, where the student body was more socially conscious, when in fact, as I recall, a lot of the unrest at the university was, came about as a result of political issues.
But the firebrand intellectuals at the university and other critics shortly discovered that the increasingly powerful and ruthless KANU government was all too eager to answer fire with real fire. Some of them had to flee the country.
Opposition was retreating and using academic freedom as a means to voice some of the concerns that politicians were no longer able to engage in. So combined with student radicalism, the university became quite a threat to Moi's rule. And I think Moi was very quick to notice that the staff union was beginning to attract some very radical elements in the university and connecting with some strong political opposition in the country.
I am jumping to 1986, which of course was a very repressive year when we had all the Mwakenya prosecutions and people were being taken to court on these trumped up charges at night. A lot of the appearances in court before the chief magistrate took place in the evenings when the suspects had no lawyers.
We had so many political prisoners in this country, and we had so many exiles, refugees from running away from Kenya. And these were mainly intellectuals who, like I said, university lecturer students. And then people like George Anyona, politicians who are being jailed, people like Koiwa Amwere, politicians who are being jailed. And something had to give. There was something wrong. And as a young person then, I was very young, I didn't know what was wrong. I just knew something was wrong.
And at that time, it's when they constructed the Nyayo House torture chambers, which were used now to arrest, torture people into submission, and then these people would be taken to the courts in the evening at 7 p.m. And the judges were there. The judiciary had already been subdued. So you already had a judiciary that was very complacent. Accused persons are being brought at 7 o'clock, and the judge does not even question why.
I got a word from Kariuki Chotora saying that they were now determined to kill me. So they would crush me like a louse, because they could not intimidate me with the detention, and they could not place me in, they could not shut me up with the salary of parliament. So now they had, the only final solution they had for me was to kill me. And I thought, I took the threat seriously. We discussed it at home, and we decided I must go into exile. Those days you could not dare, when you became very powerful, say Moi, Moi. No, you had to look behind, sideways, and then whisper Moi.
With politicians and intellectuals either in detention or on the run, Moi molded KANU into a frighteningly powerful monolith, towering over the landscape, its reach straddling the air-conditioned offices in the cities to the grass-thatched huts in the remote villages. But KANU's apparent comfort was to be interrupted by a new and different type of critic: religious leaders. From the clear skies, almost literally, a skinny, bespectacled Presbyterian preacher emerged like a ready thorn and plunged straight into the flesh of the Moi administration. On the 5th of October 1986, the Reverend Timothy Njoya, a minister at St. Andrew's PCA Church in Nairobi, fired the first salvo. He called for constitutional reforms.
On October 5, 1985, I climbed onto the St. Andrew's pulpit and said that we must reconstitute Kenya. Kenya was designed in Bahrain. It was not designed by Kenyans. Therefore, come, let us reason together. Thus says the Lord, Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18. And I called the Kenyans to come together. And I called Moi to call Ambaraza at Kamukoji. And call all the people who have been killed by the state. It was a metaphoric. I knew he could not call them. Call all the detainees, all the dissidents, or the fugitives, and let us reason together as to why we cannot reconstitute Kenya into something that is for Kenyans.
Njoya's call for reforms marked the beginning of what was to prove an effective involvement by religious leaders, both Christian and Muslim, in the push for constitutional and political reforms.
All the elites in Kenya were eggs laid by KANU. There was a society impregnated by Kenyatta and Moi, and they would reproduce small Mois and small Kenyattas. It will reproduce the same replicas of the same system of dominance as was inherited from colonial time. And therefore, we had to agitate for a new Kenya.
Gradually, religious leaders began splitting their preaching time to accommodate political messages.
I had courage to say, enough is enough. And I had the mark you this time, all this time there was freedom of broadcast because very few had access to KBC. So I went and the pulpit of St. Andrews, even when it was Kenya Broadcasting Service during Crown time, had live broadcast wired to our pulpit. So I went on to the broadcast. I said that I told Kenyans we must have a new Kenya.
Njoya wears a dog collar, as we used to call it, a full collar. He is a soldier of Christ.
Bishop Okulu used the pulpit to send messages. And later on, we had Bishop Gitari, who took on this mantle of speaking for the people and speaking for reform. These clergymen dared to go where others had failed to tread.
With time, more and more clergymen began engaging in the rare straight talk from the pulpit. Sunday prayer services started becoming KANU's political nightmare, as religious leaders increasingly made what sounded at the time as unthinkable pronouncements. And their spread presented an even nasty scenario for Moi and KANU. Like thumbnails on the floor, the emerging critics were spread around the country. Henry Okulu and Zacchaeus Okoth in Kisumu, Manasseh Kuria and Cardinal Otunga in Nairobi, David Gitari and John Njoya in Mount Kenya, Ndingi Mwana Anzeki in Nakuru, Alexander Muge in Eldoret, and in Nairobi, the streets-bound Reverend Timothy Njoya. Unlike other critics who ended in exile or jail, the clergymen arguably faced fewer risks.
The risk was not as obvious, but it was certainly there. And certainly being beaten in front of Parliament almost to death, there could be no greater risk to life and limb than what happened. So yes, they had some protection because, of course, it looks bad when you detain a church person.
But KANU's reaction to the clergy onslaught remained as dismissive as it was in earlier encounters.
Well, the argument would just have, you know, the government is, some of it will be on detention. How can you detain somebody without trial? Well, I will tell Okulu, if you want to know, don't use the pulpit to ask questions like that. Ring me or come across to me, and I'll tell you what has happened. Because if you criticize me in the pulpit, I'll criticize you in the House of Parliament. And so we go like this all the time.
Events of the late 80s were, however, to prove that the greatest threat to KANU's hold to power was not the clergymen or critics in exile and jails. The biggest threat for KANU came from within. The inner fabric of the mammoth party of Kenya's independence was gradually succumbing to the corrosive effects of the massive political powers it had amassed. Internal democracy had dropped to both tragic and farcical levels, as illustrated by the 1988 Mlolongo or queue voting system. Under this system, Daniel Arap Moi literally handpicked all the 188 members of parliament through a ballot-free election where the length of a queue of voters counted for little.
It was just a way of picking the people he wanted to become members of parliament, so that he was creating parliament for himself, not for the country. Even Kibaki was just about to be thrown out in that Mlolongo. Makiwi was a vice president.
Those elections were definitely abused. They were abused because even then there was no independent electoral commission. The elections were conducted, supervised by provincial administration. DCs were the returning officers. The shortest lines were declared winners. And also, anybody who got more than 70% of the votes cast was automatically declared the MP. That's when the anger and the real struggle for multi-party started.